us about tonight. After he finished the project, he's going to talk to us about tonight. He moved on, and he is now with Charles County Community College, where he's vice president doing economic development, customer training, all sorts of special projects. That's not what he's going to talk about. What he's going to talk about is the new plan for the monumental core of Washington, D.C., and the long tradition of Woollen and others who are planning for the national capital, really one of the truly great urban design challenges in the United States today. I give you Bob Marriott, and I do apologize for...
Thank you very much. I hope if those of you at the back can't hear and I start to trail off, start waving arms, and I'll crank it up a little bit. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and I hope you will be able to watch the two short videos that we have. It was my pleasure to work for a federal agency, the National Capital Planning Commission, for about a year and a half on their major project, actually the most important project they have undertaken since they were created. And that is the plan for the monumental core, which we will discuss this evening. Now, I particularly want to talk with you about some things that I hope will be of interest to the combined students and faculty in landscape architecture, and planning, because as Eric mentioned, this plan does include history. It does include all of everything those disciplines can bring, and it includes some of the cultural and political environmental considerations that are unique to Washington, and then again not so unique to Washington. And I wanted to talk with you about some of those, and I think what some of those may mean to us who are trying to get something done out there. But to start with, I wanted to show you two short videos. The first is part of the unveiling of the proposed plan, which was a ceremony of about 2 hours covered by C-SPAN, held in Union Station, and the speakers were a long list of congressional and presidential appointees and others, Alice Rivlin, Congressman Tom Davis, who chairs the House D.C. Subcommittee, and others, but I thought that just the piece that involves Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who is a historian by avocation and who, to my mind at least, speaks about the history of Washington and his personal association with L'Enfant and Burnham, I think eloquently. And following that, I have about 6 minutes, which is the canned presentation of the monumental core plan that explains a little bit about the history and what the problems are that the plan is trying to address. Problems is not a PC word. The challenges that the plan is trying to address. And after that, then I would like to speak with you about some of what my experience was and what I think it may portend for other cities and for the profession. So first to Senator Moynihan, and then we'll have to shuffle tapes for 30 seconds to go to the legacy plan presentation.
Good morning. I'm Senator Moynihan, New York. I'm here just to get the program going. By right of a long and still not entirely addressed role, which is to say that in the spring of 1789, in Duane Street in Lower Manhattan, Thomas Jefferson met with Alexander Hamilton, he Secretary of the Treasury, he the new Secretary of State. Hamilton had a great plan for the federal government assuming the debt that incurred by the states during the Revolutionary War, most of which was held by New Yorkers and by New Yorkers. Jefferson had no debt to deal with, but he had one condition. Yes, he would do this if we would move the capital from its natural site in Manhattan to a swamp on the banks of the Potomac River, which turned malarial in April, such that any congressman who lingered on until May would not be back in December. That was Jefferson's idea of government. He in Washington engaged young Pierre L'Enfant and a great surveyor, Banneker, to lay out the city in the then high condition of European plan. A grid that was divided by long arching avenues, and at its center, a Capitol and a White House, separated yet connected, a kind of chart of the Constitution. Jefferson, in fact, planted Norway poplars along Pennsylvania Avenue. They grow quickly, don't last long, but to define that connection. The city made its way slowly through the 19th century. Then in 1900, the Senate noticed that there were not only 4 railroad stations on what is now the Mall, but the Baltimore, Ohio was preparing to build an even bigger one right at the foot of Capitol Hill. Senator McMillan of Michigan headed the commission, which appointed a body headed by Daniel Burnham, who had just come from Chicago architect and was thinking of the terms of the city beautiful as the design of the Chicago World's Fair. They set out to redesign the mall, to create the mall in truth, and did so wonderfully well. Burnham drove the stake in the swamp where the Lincoln Memorial now resides. Mr. Cassatt, the head of the railroad, whose sister was Mary Cassatt, the painter, was persuaded to move his new railroad station down here. Not for nothing was he president of that railroad. He said he would do it if we come to build a new post office right next to his railroad, which we did, as part of 3 buildings. This was almost lost to us. 15 years ago, the roof was leaking. There was a hole in the middle. Remember, the hospital used swimming pool, but never the railroad station. We got it back. Senate Committee of Environment and Public Works put it out. And then we proceeded to finish the 3rd building. Edward Larrabee Barnes, the Thurgood Marshall Judiciary Building, right there to the east. That's the 3rd of these 3. The first was started in 1901. The 3rd was finished in 1992. And so we begin and we resume a ritual of our republic. Every century, we start out with the plan of adding something new to Washington. We have completed the ceremonial core. President Kennedy on, President Reagan, we redeveloped Pennsylvania Avenue, we saved this complex. Now is the time to move out and on. When this plan was shown to President Clinton, he was very enthusiastic, if you recall the other day, I said to him that I quoted a line of Daniel Burnham, who said, "Make no little plans. They do not have the power to stir men's minds." And we have before us a big plan, a large plan, a century plan. I also said to the President that if he's interested, that city planning is no job for the short-winded. He allowed us, he was not short-winded. But I would even say that the task of seeing this through is going to be have much less to do with those of us on this platform or our distinguished guests than the Parkland Forum. Young ladies, gentlemen, you have your work. Thank you very much.
Now, Senator Moynihan is not usually thought of as short-winded himself, but he has been one of the strong spokespeople in Congress about Washington and the problem we face as a country in having a capital that is the showplace of that so many people come to see about what is America and what are we all about, only to find that it's dangerous to walk 1 block away from the museum, and it's impossible to drive to get anywhere, and the transit system doesn't serve the museums and so forth. So the result of concerns like that on the part of Congress has been this project, which this short video presents.
When I think of all, I think of diversity. I think it's a whole group of a wide range of people coming together, just really hanging out, relaxing, strolling, walking through the park, that sort of thing.
I've lived here almost my whole life, and the buildings are beautiful. I love coming down here and remembering what they mean and who they represent in our history.
Well, I think it's really a symbol of what we can be.
This is the heart of our nation's capital, a place of renowned museums, memorials, and public spaces enjoyed by 20 million visitors each year. A place where hundreds of thousands of people live and work. Not just another downtown, but America's town square, where we gather to see our government in action.
I, William Jefferson Clinton,
To be heard.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed.
To celebrate. And to honor our heroes. Washington's splendor did not happen by accident. It derives from 200 years of bold planning. Pierre L'Enfant, working with surveyor Benjamin Banneker, laid out the original Capitol under George Washington's direction. His was a plan for the whole city, combining federal and local, public and private, grand and ordinary. But as Washington grew, key portions of L'Enfant's plan were ignored. By the early 1900s, railroad tracks crisscrossed the mall. Sheep grazed on the White House lawn. The McMillan plan saved the mall by extending it to the Potomac River and framing it with museums and monumental government buildings. And now, nearly 100 years later, Washington needs a third plan to meet the challenges ahead. By the middle of the next century, more than 40 million tourists will visit the city each year. Sites for scores of new museums and memorials will have to be found. The city's bridge, tunnel, and freeway systems are stretched to capacity. The gap between the federal city and the rest of Washington continues to widen. The National Capital Planning Commission, planners for the federal government in Washington, has a new vision for the heart of Washington, known as the Monumental Core. This plan looks ahead not only to the next decade, but to the next 50 to 100 years. It rests on 5 key ideas. The first is to build on the legacy of the historic plans, which are the foundation of modern Washington. Imagine L'Enfant's grand avenues restored and the city's historic connections to its waterfront rebuilt. Second, reunify the city and the core to create avenues of new economic opportunity. With the Capitol once again the center of Washington, North Capitol Street could be lined with new offices, stores, restaurants, and apartments. East Capitol Street, with its historic townhouses intact, will have new museums, parks, and recreation centers at the riverfront. And neglected South Capitol Street will become a dramatic gateway to Washington. The third idea is to use new museums, memorials, and other federal buildings to stimulate economic development throughout the city. Where South Capitol meets the Anacostia, for example, a major memorial or possibly a new home for the Supreme Court could rise. Fourth, reclaiming the rivers by revitalizing 11 miles of public riverfront from Georgetown to the National Arboretum. And finally, transform Washington's transportation system by removing obsolete bridges and freeways while developing new ways to move around the city without a car. Imagine the hulking southeast-southwest freeway eliminated, and the maze of bridges feeding into 14th Street reworked into a single graceful span, like Memorial Bridge. The Kennedy Center could be surrounded by new buildings and plazas instead of half-finished freeways. Imagine new ways of traveling about Washington, including a new surface transportation system around the mall and water taxis on the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, all connected to transit centers where passengers can switch easily from cars to trains, trolleys, and buses. This vision for Washington reflects years of work by federal and district planners, local citizens, and consultants from around the country. Now it's time to release it to the American public for review and comment. This is your capital. Tell us what you think. Together, we can create a legacy for our children and grandchildren, the way earlier generations did for us.
One of the drawings from the plan, which has been released in draft form. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how this works. This is a hardbound book, $5 a copy. Most of us that have been involved in planning for neighborhoods and towns have grown to, if not been trained in the notion that a way that you would do a plan for a city like Muncie or for areas around Muncie is to try and get as many of the active players, decision makers, as many citizens and neighborhood groups involved in the process and feeling as if, or in fact actually participating in deciding what would be a part of the plan so that they would take responsibility for seeing that it was carried out, creating a set of expectations out of the planning process. That has sort of happened here, but I want to talk a little bit about the difficulties in doing it for the nation's capital. For those of you that have been involved in a public planning process, you understand the costs and the complexities of trying to hold a lot of community meetings, of turning people out, of getting them to be interested in a process that takes some months. And in this case, the National Capital Planning Commission has been working on this plan for more than 5 years. And the draft was released 18 months ago and is still undergoing revisions prior to being re-released as a recommended plan. So we're probably looking at an 8 to 10 year process to prepare a plan. To understand a little bit about the situation in the nation's capital, you have to watch a bunch of movies, I think, actually, Kevin Kline and others. The culture of political power is several layers richer, or deeper at least, than most of the rest of the country. And Washington, D.C. was managed and run on a day-to-day basis by the federal government for most of its existence. It has only had a local government for a few years. And Marion Barry represents the second, third, maybe second and fourth mayor for the city of Washington. And it has evolved to a strong mayor system and is now evolving to a weak mayor system of city government, with the federal agencies resuming some responsibility for the delivery of day-to-day services in the city, even without a defined role as yet. So the city is in some considerable political disarray, but the members of Congress are and do take personal political responsibility for the city, so that a problem with building permits in the city isn't a problem that a city administrator would take care of, and no, it's not a problem that the mayor would address. It's a problem of House and Senate hearings on Capitol Hill and reports issued by defense contractors who are called in to be consultants on review procedures and contracting processes. And those reports are sent to blue ribbon committees appointed by Congress, as well as to the city government. So a process of decision-making has to follow a system that is not only more complex, it isn't even defined at the present time. So the idea that you would have a plan and that you would have a lot of people involved in the process and have a set of expectations, and that political leadership would feel politically responsible for carrying out those expectations, is hard to achieve in Washington, because those same political leaders have responsibility for the rest of the country. And indeed, a second problem is that a process that gets people involved in deciding what is needed in the Capitol has to involve itself with the function of the whole city, and with a lot of the kinds of problems that cities around this country and around the world are wrestling with: disinvestment and crime and white and now upper class minority flight to the suburbs in big numbers. The shrinkage of tax base, of the decline of the school system, and all of those kinds of things that make it difficult for the city to function effectively and be a desirable place to live. Washington still has very affluent neighborhoods and a very high per capita income, which is maintained because the high part is extremely high and the low part is extremely low of that per capita income. There is a huge chasm within the city of Washington between small groups of people that live in the Northwest and in a few other isolated pockets, and the general population. And the rest of the people that live in the region have moved to other places. So a plan to work for the city of Washington and to make it a desirable place to live and visit should involve the whole country, because it's our capital. And it should involve the whole region because it's the center of that region. And it should involve all of the people in Washington, but that's a process beyond the statutory limits of the agency that's trying to do the plan, which I'll come to. First, let me describe the region to you, for those of you who may have been there, and I can contrast it with an adjacent city that's of similar size. Baltimore, Maryland is about 700,000 population. Washington, D.C. is about 550,000. The metropolitan area of Baltimore is it's approaching 2 million. And Baltimore City is 700,000 population. The metropolitan area of Washington, D.C. is approaching 4 million. So that even though Washington, D.C. is smaller than Baltimore, the metropolitan area in which it exists is much larger, almost twice the size of Baltimore. And Washington, D.C. is actually the 5th largest political jurisdiction in the Washington region. Fairfax County is larger, and larger economically as well as in population. Montgomery County is larger, Arlington County is larger, I believe, and Prince George's County is certainly larger. So the region is dominated not by interests of Washington, D.C., but by how the suburbs function, how the Beltway works today. And the Red Line, as a series of radials, is one of a series of radials, is used as a way to go into work and get home as quick as you can, and a way for visitors to get down to the museums. 20 million a year. If they're open 250 days a year, we have, what, 100,000 visitors a day? Yes. Headed for those museums. Now, the structure of the agency involved in trying to do a process that has to involve the whole country and a region that is more concerned with the vast majority of jobs and residents and income, all of which are out in the suburbs. Montgomery County and Fairfax County are 2 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States. Prince George's County and Arlington County are not very far behind, and Washington, D.C., until 2 years ago, had the highest crime rate in the United States. So those counties, predictably, are happy to distance themselves from the problems of Washington, certainly want to distance their children and family from the problems of Washington, and would also like, at the elected official level, to have absolutely nothing to do with the problems of Washington. Those county councils and county executives certainly don't want to get roped into any kind of cooperative program with the city government of Washington. All of their press is negative. Certainly don't want to be involved in any kind of joint financial effort, because what does Washington have to bring to the table? So the suburbs are generally disinvolved, even anti-involved, if you will, in the process. They want to avoid a process of getting involved in addressing Washington's issues. Now, into this comes the National Capital Planning Commission. At a time when the federal government ran Washington, and when I say ran Washington, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers ran the water and sewage treatment plant. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was the Public Works Department, paved the streets. So they ran the city. The National Capital Planning Commission was the local government planning agency. If you had a subdivision or a building permit that you needed, you came to the National Capital Planning Commission. When home rule was started in Washington now, just a few years ago, the National Capital Planning Commission's role was redefined, and they became the planning agency for the federal government in Washington. And they now only have authority over things that affect the federal process: historic buildings, federal facilities, and that has been interpreted to mean facilities that have federal presence in them, and only those facilities that are within the urban region of Washington, which is Washington, D.C., and a little bit of Virginia that includes the Department of Defense. All of the federal agencies that are in the suburbs are not subject to the regulation of the National Capital Planning Commission, and that has had its own set of results. The National Capital Planning Commission is a commission of appointees, and I will read to you the list of the appointees. There are 3 members appointed by the President of the United States, including the Chairman Harvey Gantt, who's an architect from North Carolina, and 1 member who is a citizen from Maryland, and 1 member who is a citizen from Virginia. 2 are citizens appointed by the Mayor of the District of Columbia. Also members of the National Capital Planning Commission, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Interior, because the Park Service is a large property owner and within the Department of Interior, the Administrator of General Services, because they administer more federal agency buildings than anybody else, the Chairman of the Senate Government Affairs Committee, who at the time of the publication of this draft was William Roth, and the Chairman of the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight, which includes the D.C. Subcommittee, and that chair is William Klinger. Also on the commission are the mayor himself and the chair of the Council of the District of Columbia. Those are 12 members. An even number, always an unusual thing, balanced between 6 local and 6 federal. And of course, the 3 largest property-owning, constructing, and developing agencies are on the commission, and sometimes make motions of approval on their own projects and hire the executive director. And the National Capital Planning Commission has a staff of 50. The Department of Interior National Capital Region Park Service Office is many times larger than the National Capital Planning Commission, and in fact probably has as many planners as the National Capital Planning Commission, because they are responsible for planning and operating all of the Park Service holdings and for operating most of the events that take place on the mall. So every time there's another million anything march, that's the responsibility of the Park Service in considerable measure. So these giant federal agencies with huge political constituencies in Congress are on the commission and have to bring projects within the District of Columbia to the commission for approval. Understandably, the role of the National Capital Planning Commission and its executive director is circumspect, I guess would be a careful word. Careful would be a good word. Not to do things which those agencies would find untenable. Also, of course, there has to be a considerable level of effort paid to paying attention to the government of the District of Columbia, although at the moment the mayor and his appointees seem to have somewhat less leverage over day-to-day operations because the control board appointed by Congress seems to be increasingly running the day-to-day operations and the budget of the government of the District of Columbia. So this group asked the National Capital Planning Commission, which has no authority over residential neighborhoods, has no authority outside the District of Columbia except authority to comment on federal projects, was asked to develop a new plan for the monumental core. And that is the plan that they have recommended. The challenge of this kind of planning is that they couldn't figure out a way to mobilize the traditional planning process of citizen involvement, because citizen involvement at one level for all of us is what would we like our nation's capital to be like. And that may be very different from what would the citizens of the District of Columbia like. Most of them would like to have jobs and safe places for their kids to go to school, while our concerns would be how do we visit there, how do we get to and from the museums, how can we have a place to eat, or when will they finally have adequate restrooms on the mall. So those wide-ranging issues, which are unique to Washington because of its 20 million visitors a year, and also being a place where 500,000 people live, are not the same as Disney World, where they've got 20 or so million people a year, but where virtually no one lives, so they have to only to respond to the set of visitors. And not the same as most other cities, which may have a significant component of tourism, but which don't have a huge set of federal agencies, also with their own set of property interests and political priorities. So one of the things that's happened as the National Capital Planning Commission has become involved in these major processes like renewal of the National Archives, expansion to the Air and Space Museum, is that the agencies have moved their new facilities out of the city. And federal employment in the Washington region has fallen, mostly within the District of Columbia. There have not been significant decreases in federal employment out in the suburbs. And before we started this evening, somebody said, yeah, but how many federal agencies and how many federal employees are there outside the District of Columbia? Well, if I just walked up Rockville Pike in Montgomery County, let's see, we go past the National Institute of Health with 19,000 employees and 6,000 doctors, and across the street is the National Naval Medical Center, and behind that is the Uniformed Services Medical School. And then I would get to the Beltway, and we have the Atomic Energy Commission, and after that we reach the Health and Human Services Office. They have one building with 6,000 employees in it. We have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, the National Institutes of Standard and Technology, and the offices of the Food and Drug Administration. That's just on one road in one Montgomery County. And I probably forgot a few. That's an example of how many agencies in the biotech area have moved out to Montgomery County. And on the Virginia side, there's a similar flow of things related to the Department of Defense. So we see that rather than be subject to a series of regulations and have to go through a set of additional processes, the suburbs that are happy to have these high-paid federal employees be added to their income tax piggyback rolls are happy to have these agencies come out there, and of course they all have members of Congress interested in working on their behalf, and the District of Columbia does not have a voting member of Congress on its behalf. So now we have an agency that doesn't have authority for the city trying to recommend a plan. And they've done, I think, an admirable job of going back to a traditional approach. Now, the L'Enfant plan 200 years ago was supposed to be a plan for the whole city. And at the conjunction of the major streets were to be the public markets, and the churches, and public buildings, as well as some of the government structures that were mentioned. But of course that was all designed many, many years before the automobile. And a plan which is strong in the hearts of the educated and residing in DC is generally not fondly thought of people who live outside the District of Columbia and who have to try and figure out the street system, which is sort of anti-logical. Or at least difficult to maintain a north-south orientation in driving the city of Washington. So we have that problem, and the plan goes then to the approach of the second plan for Washington, which is that of the Macmillan Commission. Now, at the time of the Macmillan Commission, Congress still ran D.C. So the committee in Congress and the Senate that had responsibility for that was chaired by Senator McMillan. He appointed this Blue Ribbon Committee that included Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, and others, and they came up with a plan to address just what was covered in the video. We've got a terrible problem around the government buildings downtown. They've got 4 railroads, and they're going to put an even bigger station, and they're going to run a railroad track between the White House and the Capitol. Well, they addressed that, and they created a grand space, which I think is one of the wonderful urban places, certainly in this country, and given the quality of the museums and other uses that have been clustered around it, I think it's one of the quality urban spaces in the world. That's the model that they've gone to. So the plan that's proposed is addressing the following problem. Every year for the last 15 or 18 years, Congress has been petitioned by some group to erect another major memorial or monument in the city of Washington. Now, it's important to understand that these memorials and monuments don't start with Congress. All of them start with some group that wants to have a monument. Congress approves it by resolution and directs this group to put together a plan and to bring it forward to the many reviewing agencies, including the National Capital Planning Commission, for site approval as well as design approval. Unfortunately, there are no sites left. There are no good sites left for memorials. And the difficulties in locating a memorial to World War II point that out. There's been a continuing controversy, and after tentative site approval, pending design approval was given to the World War II memorial, the design was then disapproved and sent back to be redone because it's a very difficult site. And World War II veterans want a huge memorial befitting the epic proportions of the conflict in which they participated, and they want it done now before they die. And there are no sites. So that's the problem that the National Capital Planning Commission tried to address. Their solution to that is to try and find a way to create another grand urban space. And the germ of an idea is we've got a separate home for the legislative branch and a separate home for the executive branch. And for many years, Congress wanted the Supreme Court to be located right next door so they could keep an eye on the Supreme Court and make sure they didn't do anything to undermine the laws that Congress passed. But if the judicial branch is going to have its own home, let's try and use it to create another major node in the city. And we'll try and build another kind of grand mixed-use space this time, not exclusively federal, mixed-use space connecting that node back in to the existing monument core. And that is the essence of what is recommended in the plan. Now, a couple of issues that are not yet addressed. there is no method of implementation. There is a proposal to create a development corporation, but there is no defined way of creating the corporation, or of funding it, or of what the charge of that corporation would be. The plan basically says, here's a vision of what the capital could be like. But nobody has taken up the responsibility for saying, okay, how will we start to go there? 100 years ago, you could put that vision out there and understand that when a crisis like a new railroad station came up, Congress would take responsibility for acting because, after all, they ran the city. Today, that's not so clear. Today, Congress is a little bit, and would you be, antsy about taking responsibility for a city they're not sure they can save. And they are very concerned about what they're going to do. Who will get the credit for saving Washington? They have a Democratic executive branch, a Republican legislative branch. Neither side wants to come out of the box with a proposal to be criticized by the other side, and neither side wants to give the other side an opportunity to take credit for some grand scheme that might save Washington and would cost the taxpayers $1. Both are willing to let the other side come up with a scheme that's flawed so that they can point to it and say, I told you he or they couldn't do the job. So they're in a political quagmire that is Washington, and that is the way decisions somehow wander to resolution in Washington. In the meantime, more people move out, more schools close, and the quality of life, both for people that live there and for the visitors, continues to decline. So I would close with what this means for us as planners and architects and landscape architects. I think in some ways the problems with the national capital are unique because they involve this being a world center. This is the symbol of the most powerful place in the world. And the Washington radio station comes on every morning. Good morning, this is WTOP, capital of the world. And that's the way Washington thinks of itself and pretty much functions these days. So that part of it is unique. But the other problems are not unique. And all of us, in some form or other, face those kinds of organizational dilemmas and implementation problems. And I guess the question I would pose to all of us is whether or not times have changed. I don't really have a different way to go about trying to start something in motion other than you come up with a bold statement about go try and set your sights someplace and try to go there. I don't have a better way to go about doing that, but I'm not sure I see a way that this gets carried forward in today's social and political environment either. On that optimistic note, and at 9:02, I'll stop and I'll take a couple of questions and we can talk afterward if that's all right. Anybody?
What has happened in the 18 months since this came out of the process?
The process, and I was heavily involved in this process actually, is that the plan has been circulated for comment. We presented the plan to the American Planning Association, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the American Institute of Architects, the American Society of Landscape Architects, asked them for comments and endorsement. It was circulated as a series of 6 additional public meetings in Washington, in various sectors of Washington, and comments were sought, and hundreds of copies of the proposed plan were mailed out with an insert, a sort of tear-out insert, also the opportunity on the website to respond directly with comments to the plan on the website, and they have received not a lot. They've received some comments locally about how Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast is actually not very pretty, but functioning as a local neighborhood commercial street. Shouldn't the plan find some way to reinforce that, because that kind of commercial node was part of L'Enfant's original intent? Those are the kinds of comments they've received for the most part.
That circulation draft you sent me is in our library, and anyone wants to see it, it's available there.
Yes, sir.
Could you explain what the Fine Arts Commission is and what its role is supposed to be?
Well, the Fine Arts Commission has responsibility for review of projects that affect the Capitol and can be seen from the Capitol, and frequently get into parallel reviews with the National Capital Planning Commission. They've been run for some years by the man with the best Rolodex in town, and when the Fine Arts Commission is unhappy with a proposal, for example, the World War II Memorial, they simply preempted the review by the National Capital Planning Commission and issued their own report saying it should be changed. And at that point, the process becomes the proposer's responsibility to negotiate between the two reviewing agencies. And in some cases, the Fine Arts Capital Commission has approval authority, and I don't recall exactly what those circumstances are, but in other cases, they just choose projects that they wish to review and comment on in public session. So they're one of several players. They're certainly a key player on all of these monument, memorial, and museum decisions downtown. Yes, sir.
What percent of those that work in Washington, D.C. are actually residents of Washington, D.C., and not tourists or from out-of-state political operatives such as journalists or politicians? And what input have they had in the planning process?
Was it what percentage?
Yes.
Well, let me put it this way. Washington is a government town. If you pulled the government function out of Washington, almost everything else that follows would go with it, because the hotels that are there because they provide services to government visitors, government agencies, and contractors coming to do business with Washington. So all of the economy is really based on government activity. There's virtually no manufacturing. There's very little other activity except things that are in support of the functioning of the government. And a large proportion of government employees live, of course, outside the District of Columbia. Some of the best public school systems in the country are in the suburbs. One of the poorest is in the district. So everybody with kids is out or trying to go out or is sending their kids to expensive private schools. I mean, there are some good and legitimate reasons to anybody that has children for why, wherever their job is, they're not going to live in the District of Columbia. Also has a property tax rate twice that of the suburbs.
Is this proposal then presenting to the population of the city?
Oh, yes.
No, I mean the Spanish that they're not some of those politicians.
The people that actually live in the city, yes, they had a round of about 25. The question was, has this plan been presented to the people that live in the city? Before the plan was prepared, they had a series of 25 or more public meetings to just gather suggestions. After the plan was drafted and released, then that plan was circulated. They put thousands of copies out. They met with district councils, which are the neighborhood level political organization in Washington, and sent letters to all of them offering the opportunity to meet. And they held 6 open houses in different wards of the city to provide people with the opportunity to come and be briefed on the plan and then subsequently to submit comments on the plan. They also ran a public exhibit in Union Station for about a month, and where many of the people who were commuters into Washington have the opportunity to see the exhibit, pick up the brochures, and send in comments, because both the subway system and the train system have junctions in Union Station. And they ran an exhibit in the Smithsonian American History Museum for about 2 months, the same content. In the American History Museum, it was supplemented by more stuff about the history of Washington as well. So they've spent a ton of money.
What kind of response did you get from the top
Well, the plan doesn't say very much about local commercial services.
because those values are really going to be affected?
Yeah, and the plan does talk about the need to have better coordinated transportation for people to come to visit the mall and to get them involved in the rest of the city. But of course, the plan doesn't have any jurisdiction over how that takes place, and the agency has no jurisdiction. Well, I'd be pleased to answer more questions at the reception afterwards, or however you want to handle it.